for the hardest-hitting show in talk radio. The true progressive voice since 2012. This is Southpaws.
And welcome to Southpaws on the Pacifica Radio Network. We are the leaders of the revolution. My name is Darren Gibson. I am the founder, lead host, and executive producer of this show. I'm going to be hosting solo today as both Jack Prince and Katy Steele are off this week. We've got quite a few topics to discuss. We're going to talk a little bit about coronavirus. We're going to talk some January 6th stuff. Plus, we have a hammer time and off the cuff this week, so we got plenty of stuff to get to. Before we get started, a couple of reminders. You can follow us on social media by going to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. You can follow us on Twitter at Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Tumblr at southpawsradioshow.tumblr.com. You can follow us on YouTube by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. And you can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Southpaws Radio. You can listen to the show anytime at Spreaker, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, or Reason.fm by doing a search for Southpaws. Once you found our logo, you found us. We send links to our weekly episodes to our Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and YouTube accounts. You can listen to us on Global Community Radio Channel 1 every Saturday night at 11 Eastern. And you can listen to us on great Pacifica stations, including KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, KZGM in Kabul, Missouri, and KEPJ in San Antonio, Texas. So please be sure to listen to us there as well. Let's start with our big news of the day. This is John Fritz writing for USA Today. This is dated January 13th out of Washington. The Supreme Court on Thursday halted enforcement of one of President Joe Biden's signature efforts to combat COVID-19, ruling that his administration doesn't have the authority to impose vaccine or testing requirements on employers that would have covered tens of millions of Americans. The unsigned opinion, which came days after the justices heard arguments in the emergency appeal, marked the second time the nation's highest court unwound a pandemic policy of the Biden administration, again concluding that federal officials exceeded the power given to them by Congress. The court blocked Biden's eviction moratorium in August, ruling that it also was an overreach. At issue in the workplace case was whether the Occupational Safety and Health Administration had the power to impose the requirements under a 1970 law. The court wrote, quote, "Although Congress has indisputably given OSHA the power to regulate occupational dangers, it has not given that agency the power to regulate public health more broadly. Requiring the vaccination of 84 million Americans selected simply because they work for employers with more than 100 employees certainly falls in the latter category." End of quote. The decision drew a dissent from the court's 3 liberal judges. Associate Justice Stephen Breyer wrote in an opinion joined by Associate Justices Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, quote, "In our view, the court's order seriously misapplies the applicable legal standards. And in doing so, it stymies the federal government's ability to counter the unparalleled threat that COVID-19 poses to our nation's workers." End of quote. The court, in a second unsigned opinion, permitted a vaccine mandate on people employed at healthcare facilities that receive federal funding through Medicare and Medicaid. That measure affects about 10 million workers. The court wrote in the separate opinion, quote, "The challenges posed by a global pandemic do not allow a federal agency to exercise power that Congress has not conferred upon it. At the same time, such unprecedented circumstances provide no grounds for limiting the exercise of authorities the agency has long been recognized to have." End of quote. The government, the court said, appeared to have that authority, at least when it comes to requiring workplace changes for medical care it pays for. 4 of the court's conservative judges dissented. Associate Judge Clarence Thomas wrote, quote, "These cases are not about the efficacy or importance of COVID-19 vaccines. They are only about whether the administration has the statutory authority to force healthcare workers by coercing their employers to undergo a medical procedure they do not want and cannot undo. End of quote. Thomas was joined by Associate Judges Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, and Amy Coney Barrett. So it's the extreme right-wing nut job cuckoo edge of the party, my opinion. It was not immediately clear what, if any, options the Biden administration has to respond to the ruling. In a statement, the president said he was disappointed and added that it was now up to states and individual employers to determine whether to make their workplaces as safe as possible for employees. Labor Department officials did not immediately respond to a request for comment either. Biden announced policies in November that covered employers with more than 100 workers, health sites, and federal contractors. Large employers were required to set up vaccine or weekly testing programs or face penalties of nearly $14,000 per violation. The ruling in the large employer case was cheered by conservative and business groups that filed the suits. Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost, one of the Republican officials who challenged the employer rules, said, quote, "Americans have lost too much to this disease already. All of us want this pandemic to end, but it is critical that we do not lose our Constitution too." End of quote. Well, your Constitution ain't going to matter if everybody's dead, moron, idiot. Others said they worried about implications far beyond the pandemic if it makes it harder for federal agencies to respond to an emergency. Lawrence Gostin, a professor of global health law at Georgetown University, said, quote, "The court is eviscerating the very ability of the federal government to protect Americans. The justices are overturning decades of precedent upholding federal public health powers." End of quote. At issue in the large employer case was whether Congress gave OSHA authority to require vaccines or testing in a 1970 law. The law at the center of the employer case allows OSHA to set an emergency rule when a grave danger exists that could expose workers to substances or agents determined to be toxic or physically harmful or from new hazards. Biden officials argued that COVID-19 presents such a danger, and it most certainly does. A majority of the court signaled during oral arguments that it questioned whether Congress could have foreseen the law being used to address a pandemic. Several members of the court's conservative bloc said the matter should be left to states unless Congress approves a more specific authorization for such mandates. The liberal justices countered that agencies are better positioned than courts to make assessments about rapidly shifting public health emergencies. The legal wrangling occurs as the Omicron variant has sent cases skyrocketing and inundated hospitals. The court signaled it was applying a different standard to the medical worker case. Several of the court's conservatives, notably Associate Justice Brett Kavanaugh, wondered aloud why the people most directly affected by the mandate, the doctors, nurses, and others who staff hospitals, did not fight the Biden mandate. In his opinion on medical facilities, the court wrote, quote, "After all, ensuring that providers take steps to avoid transmitting a dangerous virus to their patients is consistent with the fundamental principle of the medical profession. First, do no harm." End of quote. Well, I'll tell you, the Supreme Court did a hell of a lot of harm to this country. Folks, we need term limits on the Supreme Court justices, mandatory retirements once they hit a certain age. This all needs to change now. Let's get to our next really important story. This is something that has not been publicized by the mainstream media whatsoever. This is an important story, so we need to get to this. This is Nicholas Wu writing for Politico.com. This is dated January 10th. The public focus of Congress's January 6th investigation so far is what happened in Washington, D.C. Behind the scenes, the probe's state-level work is kicking into overdrive. The House committee investigating the Capitol attack has gathered thousands of records from state officials and interviewed a slate of witnesses as it attempts to retrace Donald Trump's attempts to subvert the 2020 election, particularly in 4 key states that swung the presidency to Joe Biden. They're getting ready to take their work public, possibly as soon as the spring. In an interview, Select Panel Chair Representative Benny Thompson, Democrat of Mississippi, said, quote, "We want to let the public see and hear from those individuals who conducted elections in those states." End of quote. He described those witnesses as particularly important given their mandates to keep elections fair and impartial while hailing from one political party. The voluminous documents state election officials have sent the January 6th committee, obtained by Politico through open records requests, underscore the depth of Trump's pressure campaign directed at the typically lower-level administrators of presidential balloting. The emails, texts, and phone recordings also add consequential context to previously reported incidents, such as Trump's call to Georgia's top elections investigator and Mark Meadows' outreach to Georgia election officials. The select panel asked states for any scrap of evidence to justify allegations of election fraud that Trump baselessly promoted, focusing much of its efforts on officials in Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Those states found virtually no evidence of fraud, according to Thompson. Among the officials who spoke with the committee was Katy, Pennsylvania's Secretary of State during the 2020 election, according to a source familiar with the situation who was not authorized to speak publicly. A spokesperson for the Pennsylvania Secretary of State declined to comment on whether the panel had been in touch with the state's officials. Mainly, the record shows state officials trying to either mollify or ignore Trump and his allies without distorting election results or embracing debunked claims of vote tampering. A spokesperson for the select panel declined to comment on the documents. Just one day before Georgia was set to certify the 2020 election results and seal Trump's defeat, records turned over to the January 6th committee show a text message that arrived on the phone of Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. Then White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows texted Raffensperger in a November 19, 2020 message obtained through a public records request. That text read this way, quote, "Mr. Secretary, Mark Meadows here. If you could give me a brief call at your convenience. Thank you." End of quote. It doesn't appear that Raffensperger, a Republican, responded to Meadows. His office sent no reply to one Meadows text because aides weren't sure if it was real, according to CNN. But it was not the last time Raffensperger would hear from Trump's allies as they sought to pressure state-level officials to overturn Trump's loss. A spokesperson for Georgia's Secretary of State did not respond to a request for comment. Meadows texted Raffensperger a second time on the morning of December 5, 2020, asking him to call the White House switchboard to set up a call. Meadows told Raffensperger, quote, "Your voicemail is full," end of quote. Raffensperger has already interviewed with the panel, according to Thompson, who praised him as very straightforward in his testimony. A previously unreported email from one of Raffensperger's top aides, Jordan Fuchs, was also turned over to the committee. In it, Fuchs responded to Meadows' December 22, 2020 trip to Georgia's Cobb County during the state's signature match audit. She emailed Meadows to clarify a few items about the rejection rate of absentee ballots, something Trump and his allies had alleged was much lower than normal. Fuchs's note included the text of a press release sent out by the Secretary of State's office a month beforehand with a more thorough explanation of how the office evaluated absentee ballots. Meadows' attorney did not respond to a request for comment. Also included in the document dump are emails between Senator Lindsey Graham's office and Raffensperger's office, which shows how a previously reported call between the two officials came about roughly 2 weeks after the 2020 election. A Graham staffer told two of Raffensperger's top aides on November 12, 2020, quote, "Hope you're doing well. Senator Graham has requested a call with Secretary Raffensperger at his earliest convenience," end of quote. The call between the two men ended with Graham indicating to Raffensperger some ballots should be tossed out, the Georgia official said later. Graham's office declined to comment, of course. The state also turned over a previously reported audio recording of a December 23, 2020 call between Trump and Francis Watson, the chief investigator in the Georgia Secretary of State's office, and a brief call between Watson and an unidentified staffer. In the December 23rd call, Trump had urged Watson to find dishonesty in the state's election results. Now, here's the important part that's not being reported in the mainstream media, folks. As Trump's team pushed its discredited voter fraud narrative, the National Archives received forged certificates of ascertainment declaring him and then Vice President Mike Pence the winners of both Michigan and Arizona and their electors after the 2020 election. Let me repeat that. The National Archives received forged certificates of ascertainment declaring Trump and Pence the winners of Michigan and Arizona, which was a lie. Public records requests show the secretaries of states for those states sent those certificates to the January 6th panel, along with correspondence between the National Archives and state officials about the documents. Spokespeople for the Michigan and Arizona Secretaries of State declined to comment on the documents. The offices confirmed that Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson and Arizona Secretary of State Katy Hobbs, both Democrats, and their staff met with the panel in November. Hobbs' spokesperson, C. Murphy Hebert, said, quote, "They mostly discussed election administration in Arizona, the 2020 elections, threats and harassment directed toward the office, and the Cyber Ninjas partisan ballot review," end of quote. Benson and her staff took questions from the committee on the 2020 election and events leading up to the January 6th riot, according to Tracy Wimmer, who is Benson's spokesperson. The National Archives sent emails to the Arizona Secretary of State on December 11, 2020, passing along the forged certificates, quote, "for your awareness," end of quote, and informing the state officials the archives would not accept them. Arizona then took legal action against at least one of the groups who sent in the fake documents, sending a cease and desist letter to a pro-Trump sovereign citizen group telling them to stop using the state seal and referring the matter to the state attorney general. Hobbs wrote to one of the pro-Trump groups, quote, "By affixing the state seal to documents containing false and misleading information about the results of Arizona's November 3rd, 2020 general election, you undermine the confidence in our democratic institutions," end of quote. That group's leader, Lori Osiecki, had told the Arizona Republic in December 2020 that she decided to send in the certificates after taking part in post-election rallies and after attending a day-long meeting in Phoenix that had included Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani. The group that forged the Michigan certification had not used the state seal, and it appears state officials there took no further action after the archives rejected it. Well, I can tell you why that group didn't use the state seal in Michigan, because if they did, Dana Nessel would have some people in jail by now. Guaranteed. So this is what Republicans do, folks. This is all of them. They're all evil, violent, conservative savages. All of them. They lie, they steal, they cheat, they'll fabricate evidence, they'll do anything just to get in power and stay in power. That's all of them. Every single one of them. Period. End of story. You're not going to argue with me. That's the way it is. Speaking of crooked politicians, we got to get to this story. This is Stephen Greenhouse writing for The Guardian. This is also dated on January 10th. And by crooked politicians, I mean the Democrats, corporate-owned Democrats, that screwed Bernie Sanders not once, but twice. Let's get to this story here. The Guardian did an exclusive interview with Senator Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont. So here's what they wrote. Senator Bernie Sanders has called on Democrats to make a major course correction that focuses on fighting for America's working class and standing up to powerful corporate interests because the Democrats' legislative agenda is stalled and their party faces tough prospects in this November's elections. The White House is likely to see his comments as a shot across the bow by the left wing of a party increasingly frustrated at how centrist Democrats have managed to scupper or delay huge chunks of Biden's domestic policy plans. In an interview with The Guardian, Sanders called on Joe Biden and the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer to push to hold votes on individual bills that would be a boon to working families, citing extending the child tax credit, cutting prescription drug prices, and raising the federal hourly minimum wage to $15. I love us. They say it's the left wing of the party. Here's the thing. Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat. He is an independent. And I don't know why the media keeps calling him a Democrat. Well, actually, I do know. They're trying to frame things to their agenda. Let me continue. Such votes would be good policy and good politics, the Vermont senator insisted, saying they would show the Democrats battling for the working class while highlighting Republican opposition to hugely popular policies. Sanders said, quote, "It is no great secret that the Republican Party is winning more and more support from working people. It's not because the Republican Party has anything to say to them. It's because in too many ways the Democratic Party has turned its back on the working class." End of quote. He's right. He's right. Sanders, who ran for the party's nomination in both 2016 and 2020, losing out in fierce contest to Hillary Clinton and then Biden, is a popular figure on the left of the party. Let me rephrase that sentence. Bernie Sanders got screwed in 2016 and 2020. That is a fact. The Democratic Socialist from Vermont remains influential and has been supportive of Biden during his first year as the party tries to cope with the twin threats of the pandemic and a resurgent and increasingly extremist Republican Party. Let me add, violent Republican Party. But his comments appear to reflect a growing discontent and concern with the Biden administration's direction. Sanders continued, quote, "I think it's absolutely important that we do a major course correction. It's important that we have the guts to take on the very powerful corporate interests that have an unbelievably powerful hold on the economy of this country." End of quote. The individual bills that Sanders favors might not attract the 60 votes needed to overcome a Republican filibuster, and a defeat on them could embarrass the Democrats. But Sanders, chairman of the Senate Budget Committee and one of the nation's most prominent progressive voices, said, quote, "People can understand that you sometimes don't have the votes, but they can't understand why we haven't brought up important legislation that 70 or 80% of the American people support." End of quote. Sanders spoke to The Guardian on January 6th, the same day he issued a statement that the best way to safeguard our democracy is not just to enact legislation that protects voting rights, but to address the concerns of the vast majority of Americans for whom, quote, "there is a disconnect between the realities of their lives and what goes on in Washington." End of quote. He said millions of Americans were concerned with such painful realities as low wages, dead-end jobs, debt, homelessness, lack of health care. In that statement, he said many working-class Americans have grown disaffected with the political system because nothing changes for them, quote, "or if it does, it's usually for the worse." End of quote. In the interview, Sanders repeatedly said the Democrats need to demonstrate vigorously and visibly that they're fighting to improve the lives of working-class Americans. Sanders said, quote, "The truth of the matter is people are going to work and half of them are living paycheck to paycheck. People are struggling with health care, with prescription drugs. Young families can't afford child care. Older workers are worried to death about retirement." End of quote. Sanders has long been troubled by America's increasing wealth and income inequality, but he made clear that he thinks it is time for Democrats to take on the ultra-wealthy and powerful corporations, a move he said vast numbers of Americans would support. Quote, "They want the wealthy to start paying their fair share of taxes. They think it's absurd that Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk don't pay a nickel in federal taxes." End of quote. He praised Biden for pushing for improved child care and extending the child tax credit, but he said it would also be good to, quote, "show working people that you are willing to step up and take on the greed of the ruling class in America right now." End of quote. He pointed repeatedly to the high prices for prescription drugs as an example of corporate greed. He added, quote, "There's no issue that people care more about than that we pay the highest prices for prescription drugs in the world." End of quote. He added that the pharmaceutical industry has 1,500 lobbyists in Washington who, quote, "tried everything to make sure we don't lower the cost of pharmaceuticals." End of quote. Sanders added, quote, "I think the Democrats are going to have to clear the air and say to the drug companies, and say it loudly, we're talking about the needs of the working class, and use the expression working class. The Democrats have to make clear that they're on the side of the working class and ready to take on the wealthy and powerful. That is not only the right thing to do, but I think it will be the politically right thing to do." End of quote. Last Wednesday evening, Sanders did a nationwide live stream in which he talked with the leaders of 3 long strikes: Warrior Met Coal in Alabama, Special Metals in West Virginia, and the Rich Product Corporation's John Donaire Desserts subsidiary in Southern California. Noting that hedge funds or billionaires own large stakes in all three companies, he railed against those companies for offering modest raises or demanding that workers pay far more for health coverage, even though the owners' wealth has soared during the pandemic thanks to the booming stock market. Sanders said, quote, "These entities, where the people on top have done phenomenally well, are squeezing their workers and lowering the standard of living for workers who are striking. It's unacceptable." End of quote. In December, Sanders went to Battle Creek, Michigan to support 1,400 Kellogg's workers who were on strike at cereal factories in that city, as well as in Memphis, Tennessee, Omaha, Nebraska, and Lancaster, Pennsylvania. In the interview, Sanders said, quote, "I think the Democratic Party has to address the long-simmering debate, which is, which side are you on? Are you prepared to stand with working families and take on powerful corporate interests?" End of quote. Sanders voiced frustration with the lack of progress on Biden's Build Back Better legislation, which the Democrats sought to enact through budget reconciliation, a process that requires only a simple majority to pass. That effort was slowed by lengthy negotiations with the centrist senators Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, and then blocked when Manchin said he opposed the $2 trillion package, sparking left-wing fury and deep frustration in the White House. Sanders said, quote, "We have tried a strategy over the last several months, which has been mostly backdoor negotiations with a handful of senators. It hasn't succeeded on Build Back Better or on voting rights. It has demoralized millions of Americans." End of quote. He called for reviving a robust version of Build Back Better and also called for holding votes on individual parts of that legislation that would help working-class Americans. Sanders said, quote, "We have to bring these things to the floor. The vast majority of people in the Democratic caucus are willing to fight for good policy. If I were Senator Sinema and a vote came up to lower the outrageously high cost of prescription drugs, I'd think twice if I want to get reelected in Arizona to vote against that. If I were Mr. Manchin and I know that tens of thousands of struggling families in West Virginia benefited from the expansion of the child tax credit, I'd think long and hard before I voted against it." End of quote. Sanders also called for legislation on another issue he has championed, having Medicare provide dental, vision, and hearing benefits. Quote, "All these issues, they are not just Bernie Sanders standing up and saying this would be a great thing. They are issues that are enormously popular, and on every one of them, the Republicans are in opposition. But a lot of people don't know that because the Republicans haven't been forced to vote on them." End of quote. And you know what? He's right. It needs to be on the public record of who voted for and who voted against the working class. Let's go ahead to our next story here. Going to go to some COVID stuff. This is David K. Lee writing for NBC News. This is dated January 11th. Here's proof, folks, that vaccines work. A company-wide vaccine mandate appears to have ended a grim weekly event at United Airlines, the death of an employee from COVID-19, the carrier's top executive said Tuesday. In an open letter to his workforce, CEO Scott Kirby said that while there are 3,000 United workers now infected with the virus, quote, "0 of our vaccinated employees are currently hospitalized," end of quote. The airline chief painted a stark picture of the deadly toll COVID-19 has taken on his company. He wrote, quote, "Prior to our vaccine requirement, tragically, more than one United employee on average per week was dying from COVID. But we've now gone 8 straight weeks with 0 COVID-related deaths among our vaccinated employees, based on United's prior experience and the nationwide data related to COVID fatalities among the unvaccinated. That means there are approximately 8 to 10 United employees who are alive today because of our vaccine requirement." End of quote. United now employs about 85,000 people, the company said, and back in August it became the first U.S. carrier to require COVID-19 vaccinations for all domestic employees. Kirby acknowledged that the vaccine mandate is not popular in some circles of his company, but he insisted, quote, "It's the right thing to do. In dealing with COVID, 0 is the word that matters. 0 deaths and 0 hospitalizations for vaccinated employees. And while I know that some people still disagree with our policy, United is proving that requiring the vaccine is the right thing to do because it saves lives. End of quote. The nation's recent struggle with the Omicron surge wreaked havoc on airlines, especially during the heavy holiday travel period. On one particular day during the spike, 1/3 of United employees at Newark Liberty International Airport called in sick, according to Kirby. Lawyers for United workers suing over the vaccine mandate and union representatives of the carrier's pilots and flight attendants could not immediately be reached for comment on Tuesday. The Biden administration has been pushing for major companies like United to enforce vaccine mandates, though it's unclear if those efforts will survive judicial review. Still, the White House seized on Kirby's letter on Tuesday and held it up as an example of vaccine mandates working. Ben Wakana, the Deputy Director of Strategic Communications and Engagement for the White House's COVID-19 response team, tweeted this, quote, "That's the difference. That's vaccines. That's a requirement." End of quote. According to the latest CDC data, about 71.5% of Americans 12 and older have received at least 2 shots of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine or 1 dose of the single jab Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It really is that simple. And I'm going to reiterate what I said on last week's show. We mandate vaccines for everything else. Measles, mumps, rubella, smallpox, you name it. Polio. And those rates are 90% and higher, pretty much everywhere. Yet we can't get over 70%. We can't get 80. We can't get 90 because of misinformation from evil, violent, conservative savages. Let me just be blunt with you. The Republican Party and all Republicans are the enemy of this country, and you can quote me on that because that's the truth. We got some more COVID news. Let's get to this story. This is from WMAQ Television. They're the NBC owned and operated in Chicago. This was dated January the 4th. Why are so many vaccinated people getting COVID-19 lately? A couple of factors are at play, starting with the emergence of the highly contagious Omicron variant. Omicron is more likely to infect people, even if it doesn't make them very sick. And its surge coincided with the holiday travel season in many places. People might mistakenly think the COVID-19 vaccines will completely block infection, but the shots are mainly designed to prevent severe illness. That is according to Louis Mansky, a virus researcher at the University of Minnesota. And the vaccines are still doing their job on that front, particularly for people who've gotten boosters. 2 doses of the Pfizer, BioNTech, or Moderna vaccines or 1 dose of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine still offer strong protection against serious illness from Omicron. While those initial doses aren't very good at blocking Omicron infection, boosters, particularly with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, rev up levels of the antibodies to help fend off infection. Omicron appears to replicate much more efficiently than previous variants. And if infected people have high virus loads, there's a greater likelihood they'll pass it on to others, especially the unvaccinated. Vaccinated people who get the virus are more likely to have mild symptoms, if any, since the shots trigger multiple defenses in your immune system, making it much more difficult for Omicron to slip past them all. Advice for staying safe hasn't changed. Doctors say to wear masks indoors, avoid crowds, and get vaccinated and boosted. Even though the shots won't always keep you from catching the virus, they'll make it much more likely you stay alive and out of the hospital. The Omicron variant accounted for 95% of new coronavirus infections last week, according to U.S. health officials' latest estimates. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention posted its newest estimates Tuesday. The CDC uses genomic surveillance data to make projections about which versions of the COVID-19 viruses are causing the most new infections. The latest estimates suggest a dramatic swing in just 1 month in which version of the coronavirus is most abundant. Beginning in late June, the Delta variant was the main version causing U.S. infections. The CDC said more than 99.5% of coronaviruses were Delta as recently as the end of November. The CDC's estimates are based on coronavirus specimens collected each week through university and commercial laboratories and state and local health departments. Scientists analyze their genetic sequences to determine which versions of the COVID-19 viruses are most abundant. However, those specimens represent just a small fraction of what's out there. More than 2.2 million cases were reported in the last week in the U.S. The CDC has been revising estimates for past weeks as it gets more data. So right there it is, folks. Get vaccinated. Wear a mask. And apparently the CDC is going to update their mask data. They're recommending that everybody get N95 masks or KN95 or KF94. Get the most protection you can. The masks are readily available. You can go anywhere and get them now. Yeah, you might pay, but it's worth it. It's worth it if you don't get COVID. Trust me, it was not fun for me having to quarantine. It's not fun to get sick. And yet we still have people, mostly Republicans, oh, this is just a bad flu. No, it isn't. It really isn't. And I'm sorry, I have no sympathy for anybody that refuses to get vaccinated for no good reason other than to own the libs or because they think it's fake, they think it's phony. I have members of my family that are probably going to lose their jobs because they refuse to get vaccinated. And if you think I feel sorry for them, think again. You need to do your part to help others. You need to do your part. This should be an effort similar to a war effort. We need to all come together and do our part to end this virus now. Go get vaccinated. Take a friend with you. Take a family member with you that hasn't been vaccinated yet. Make them go. Plead with them. Beg them. Do whatever you need to do. Mock them. Cajole everything. Whatever it takes to get them to get that shot. Because it'll help save their lives and it'll help save the life of somebody you love. I guarantee it. Speaking of more COVID stuff, we got to get to our next topic here. Oh boy, but in order to do that, we need to play the appropriate music.
Stop! Hammer time!
Oh yeah, it's hammer time. It is time to drop the hammer on the douchebag of the week. We might as well get to this. The winner this week, Green Bay Packers quarterback Aaron Rodgers. I have this story. This is Olaf Imahan Ocean writing for The Hill. This is dated January the 5th. Green Bay Packers quarterback Aaron Rodgers lashed out Wednesday at a journalist who said he wouldn't cast an MVP vote for Rodgers due to his anti-vaccine stance. Rodgers has some choice comments for MVP voter Hub Arkush, the editor of ChicagoFootball.com. Here's what Rodgers called him. Quote, I think he's a bum. I think he's an absolute bum. He doesn't know me. I don't know who he is. No one knew who he was probably until yesterday's comments. I listened to his comments, but to say he had his mind made up in the summertime, in the off-season, that I had zero chance of winning MVP, in my opinion, should exclude future votes. End of quote. By the way, he said this at a press conference. He added this. Quote, if he wants to go on a crusade and collude and come up with an extra letter to put on the award just for the season and make it the most valuable vaccinated player, then he should do that. End of quote. Arkush, a longtime Chicago Bears analyst and columnist, said in a radio appearance on 670 AM The Score in Chicago on Tuesday that he wouldn't vote for the star quarterback due to his refusal to be vaccinated against COVID-19. Arkush told the host, quote, I don't think you can be the biggest jerk in the league and punish your team and your organization and your fan base the way he did and be the most valuable player. Has he been the most valuable player on the field? Yeah, you can make that argument, but I don't think he is clearly that much more valuable than Jonathan Taylor or Cooper Kupp or maybe even Tom Brady. End of quote. On Wednesday, Arkush said he made a big mistake sharing his thoughts on his MVP vote. He told 670 AM The Score, quote, it doesn't really have much to do with Aaron Rodgers. Being one of the 50 selectors in the AP poll is a real honor and privilege, and I was pleasantly surprised when they asked me to join. The only thing they really ask us is not to tell people who we voted for until the award is presented, and what they really mean is just don't talk about it. End of quote. So let's see, the NFL probably came back on him and said, oh, you shouldn't be talking about this. You know, Rodgers is a prominent asset to the National Football League. No, he isn't. He's a moron. This is the guy that wanted to host Jeopardy because he thought he was smart. Apparently he's not. Apparently he's stupid. Good Lord. And people jump on Mayim Bialik. Mayim Bialik's a anti-vaxxer. Blah, blah, blah. No, she isn't. She is a neuroscientist. Oh, boy. I guess I might have to pull the trigger and try and get Mayim Bialik on this show. That would be an interesting talk. Let me continue the story here. Rodgers, a three-time league MVP, became the center of controversy in the league earlier this season for misleading the public about his COVID-19 vaccination status, telling the media during training camp that he is immunized against the virus, even though he refused to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, I wonder what he means by immunized. What exactly does that mean? Does that mean he's had the COVID and recovered? No. What immunized means is you go get a vaccine. You go to the doctor or you go to the pharmacy or you go to a clinic and you roll up your sleeve and you get a needle put in your arm and medicine is injected into your arm. Do it, folks. I can't believe I have to continually mention this. Go get vaccinated. It's unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. So to Aaron Rodgers, once again proving that he's not very bright, we have this message for you.
Don't be a douchebag.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, Aaron, why don't you do something you know about, like throw a football? You know, the evil, violent, conservative savages like to tell athletes who express their opinions about politics that they don't like, oh, you just need to go play ball. You need to throw a football. You need to hit a baseball, whatever. You know what? It's time to turn it around on these evil, violent, conservative savages. They deserve it. They've been doing this for 40 years. It's time they get a dose of the medicine they've been dishing out. Oh, good God. I want to get to a story that we didn't get to talk about because this has just been crazy for the last little while. I want to get to this story from the Huffington Post. We had mentioned on last week's show about Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz teaming up for a news conference, complaining and whining and crying about the anniversary of January 6th. Well, Marjorie Taylor Greene has more reasons to be angry, so let's get to it. This is Nina Golgowski writing for the Huffington Post dated January the 3rd. Just one day after her personal Twitter account was permanently suspended, Georgia Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene from the QQ Party announced that she has temporarily lost access to posting and commenting on Facebook due to a similar policy violation. The far-right conspiracy theorist Republican announced her suspension on a small conservative social media site on Monday, calling Facebook's brief ban, which lasts 24 hours, quote, beyond censorship of speech, end of quote. Hey, Toots, they're a privately owned company. They can do whatever the hell they want to. Deal with it. Here's what else she posted on this violent, evil, conservative social media website. Quote, who appointed Twitter and Facebook to be the authorities of information and misinformation? When big tech decides what political speech of elected members is accepted and what's not, then they are working against our government and against the interest of our people. End of quote. No, honey, you need to take a look in the mirror because you're working against all of the working class. Because you're a nut job. You're a nut job that's in the pockets of the oligarchs, the rich. Let me continue here. Both Twitter and Facebook are privately owned companies with their own sets of standards for user conduct that includes bans on users posting misinformation related to COVID-19. A spokesperson for Meta, the parent company of Facebook, confirmed to Huffington Post that it has removed activity on her account that violated the site's policies. The spokesperson said that shutting down her account, quote, for this violation would be beyond the scope of our policies, end of quote. So they only gave her 24 hours in Facebook jail, which I've enjoyed multiple times. There's ways around it, folks. Sock puppet accounts. Got news for you. Sock puppet accounts. Green shared a copy of the suspension notification she received, which flagged a post she made on both Facebook and Twitter on Saturday. This same post led to her permanent removal from Twitter on Sunday after it was found that she violated the site's rules for a fifth time, which leads to an automatic ban. The post listed ways that America is no longer free because of the coronavirus pandemic. It featured a number of falsehoods, including that unvaccinated healthy people are a subclass, that coronavirus masks make children sick, and that extremely high amounts of COVID vaccine deaths are ignored and government-forced vaccine mandates increase. Let's just take these one by one. Unvaccinated, I was going to say unhealthy people. Well, they are, because they're not getting vaccinated. Unvaccinated healthy people are a subclass. Nope. Next one. Coronavirus masks make children sick. Nope. Extremely high amounts of COVID vaccine deaths are ignored and government-forced vaccine mandates increase. According to the notification she shared, Facebook informed her, quote, this post goes against our standards on misinformation that could cause physical harm, so only people who manage Marjorie Taylor Greene can see it. If you think we've made a mistake, you can disagree with the decision, end of quote. That's the standard boilerplate. You're being put in Facebook jail. If you want to appeal, you can, but we don't have enough people to appeal it, to look at your appeal, so the computer's just going to look at it and tell you, no, you're still banned. Because that's how it works, folks. I know. Last year, Twitter and Facebook rolled out a long list of rules related to COVID-19 misinformation and activity in an effort to stop the spread of potentially harmful content. Facebook's list, which can be viewed online, includes rules against posts that undermine the severity of COVID, posts that make false claims about masks, including that wearing a mask can make you ill, and posts that make false claims about how and where COVID can be transmitted and who can be infected. Greene appeared to put on a resilient face in the wake of her Twitter ban, declaring Monday that her ouster has only made her, quote, more determined, stronger, and effective. The sun is setting on Twitter, end of quote. And by the way, she posted that 30 minutes before announcing that she had been temporarily booted from Facebook as well. Yes. I got news for you folks that are screaming, First Amendment, free speech. Lies are not protected free speech. Not all speech is to be protected. Not all speech is protected. Nor should it be. Once again, I cite the example that was used in a previous Supreme Court case. You cannot yell fire in a crowded theater when there is indeed no fire. You will go to jail. Full stop. Don't pass go. Don't collect $200. If you're really concerned about it, then you need to petition Congress to make social media a public utility under the guidance of the public, not large corporations, not one person, not a hedge fund. It needs to be a public utility if you feel this way. And we have advocated for that for years on this show, and we will continue to advocate for such a thing. I also want to get to this story. I think we mentioned it real briefly last week, but we haven't really dug into it. So let's get to this story. This is from Business Insider. This is Kayla Epstein writing for Business Insider. Employees at the Democratic National Committee chose to unionize, with 2/3 of the eligible staff signing union cards to make the vote official. The DNC staff's decision to unionize with Service Employees International Union Local 500 marks perhaps the most significant organizing effort in politics yet, As the Democratic Party's main organizing apparatus, its decisions can help set the tone for political campaigns, private firms, and other party workforces to follow suit. DNC staffer and union leader Allison Goh said in a statement, quote, "Throughout this process, our aim has been not only to improve the lives of current and future staff at the DNC, but to ensure our staff, no matter where they live, are protected and given the resources they need to thrive in their careers and succeed in our mission to elect Democrats up and down the ballot." End of quote. Former Representative Donna Edwards, a Democrat of Maryland, served as an independent observer and finalized the card count. The union will now formally negotiate a contract with the DNC. Management has publicly supported the employees' union drives. Now, whether or not they support them privately, that's another story. Now, I'll mention that at the end of this story here. The union will now enter into contract negotiations with DNC management. In a statement, DNC Executive Director Sam Cornell said the committee is, quote, "proud to voluntarily recognize SEIU Local 500 after a majority of DNC employees expressed their desire for union representation in a mutually agreed upon bargaining unit." End of quote. The effort to unionize has been in the works since at least 2018, according to a DNC union spokesperson. Lucas Acosta, senior spokesperson and coalitions director at the DNC, told Business Insider in December, quote, "We wanted to send out a strong signal to campaigns, to state parties, to other groups in the political sphere that this is something that we should do to stand with our allies who have stood with us for so long. There's definitely a tone-setting component of what our goal was." End of quote. The DNC's move to organize is part of a broader effort among Democratic campaign workers and staffers at political strategy firms to unionize as the pandemic forces the nation to reckon with workplace culture. The phenomenon is limited to the Democratic Party, though. Republicans, whose policy stances are more skeptical of unions, no, they're more violent toward unions, have not seen similar organizing efforts in their ranks. In a statement regarding the DNC's choice to unionize, the Republican National Committee Chief of Staff said, quote, "We applaud the DNC for rendering themselves even more useless. Perhaps they'll offer tenure next." End of quote. Yeah. That guy, like every other evil, violent, conservative savage, is an asshole. Period. Continuing. In October, employees of the Democratic digital firm Rising Tide Interactive, which creates social media and email strategies for politicians, voted to unionize with SEIU Local 500. Several other firms have organized with the Campaign Workers Guild, founded in 2017 to organize campaigns and the companies that support them. In April, staff at the progressive digital firm Fireside Campaigns voted to unionize with CWG. Workers at Break Something Incorporated followed suit and announced in August that management had voluntarily recognized their union. Act Blue, the primary fundraising platform for Democrats, also unionized with CWG in 2020. The company voluntarily recognized CWG as its workers' bargaining representative and welcomed the union in a chipper blog post. One Democratic consultant told Business Insider in December, quote, "Every head of a progressive group I know says employees have different expectations and needs than they did a decade ago. It's part of that broader conversation you're seeing happening everywhere. You recognize that you've got to meet your employees where they are, and your employees are in a different place." End of quote. So the Democrats can say all they want to, that they support organized labor, they support unions, they support the working class. Talk is cheap. Actions speak louder. You need to raise the minimum wage. You need to get single-payer universal health care. Strengthen retirement for workers. Strengthen the right to organize. There's a lot of things that the Democrats should be doing, because you can't rely on the Republicans to do it. They won't. They'll do everything for the rich buddies, but as far as the working class, as Carlin said, they don't give a about you. They truly don't. I want to go ahead and end the show with a couple of off-the-cuff segments. This is from the Associated Press. This is dated January 11th out of Key West, Florida. Always remember to tip your server if you know what's good for you. A tourist made a big impression in a Key West bar by ordering drinks 3 times on New Year's Eve without leaving a tip. That enabled the staff to easily track him down after police released webcam video showing vandals setting fire to a Christmas tree. The arson caused more than $5,000 in damage to the city's landmark buoy, marking the southernmost point in the United States, and set the island's Coconut Telegraph gossip chain into high alert, according to a report from the Miami Herald. Like other locals across the city, bartender Cameron Briotti watched the video and recognized the 21-year-old man who had stiffed him at Irish Kevin's on Key West's famous Duval Street. Briotti told the Miami Herald, quote, "I knew immediately that I had served him and that he had used a card so his name would be on the slips," end of quote. The bar's general manager, Dalen Starks, turned to recordings from the ton of cameras that watch over the bar each night and matched credit card receipts to time-stamped videos of the man and his 22-year-old friend. Starks said, quote, "We could follow them the whole time, in and out of the bar. We could see them getting rejected from all the girls they were trying to hit on," end of quote. Armed with their identifications and matching their movements to the vandalism down the street, police swiftly announced arrest warrants for the vandalism suspects, and city workers quickly restored the 20-ton concrete monument, which proclaims it stands just 90 miles from Cuba. Starks told the Associated Press Tuesday, quote, "We've all been that age and made dumb mistakes, and we just learn from them. So I hope that's what they do, is learn from the mistake," end of quote. I'm disappointed that AP didn't announce who they were, the vandals. And we've got one more off the cuff. This is also from the Associated Press out of Woburn, Massachusetts. This is dated January 6th. A letter sent from a U.S. soldier stationed in Germany to his mother in Massachusetts has been delivered 76 years after it was sent. Army Sergeant John Gonsalves, who was 22 at the time, wrote to his mother in Woburn in December 1945 after the official end of World War II. That's according to a report from WFXT television. The letter would sit unopened for more than 75 years before being found in a U.S. Postal Service distribution facility in Pittsburgh. The letter reads, quote, "Dear Mom, received another letter from you today and was happy to hear that everything is okay. As for myself, I'm fine and getting along okay, but as far as the food, it's pretty lousy most of the time." End of quote. He signed the letter, quote, "Love and kisses, your son Johnny. I'll be seeing you soon, I hope." End of quote. Gonsalves died in 2015. His mother has died as well. But the U.S. Postal Service found an address for his widow, Angelina, whom the soldier met 5 years after he sent the letter. Alongside the decades-old mail, U.S. Postal Service employees also sent a letter of their own saying, quote, "Delivering this letter was of utmost importance to us," end of quote. After the Gonsalves family received the letter, they called the facility and thanked them. Angelina Gonsalves told WFXT television, quote, "Imagine that, 76 years. I just couldn't believe it. And then just his handwriting and everything. It was so amazing," end of quote. The 89-year-old Angelina Gonsalves spent another holiday without her husband. But she said this year, quote, "It's like he came back to me, you know?" End of quote. That's a really sweet story. And it was one that I really wanted to share with you. We are out of time for this week. We'll be back next week. I'm Darren Gibson. For Jack Prince and Katy Steele, please support independent media and the First Amendment.
The stations that carry Southpaws do not necessarily share the opinions expressed on the show. Southpaws is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is copyrighted by Big D Entertainment, all rights reserved.